safety first is just kind of a slogan. It's like shifted the blame to the
That's right.
people who are exposed to the technology,
But
right?
it was shiftable back and forth, as Phil pointed out as well,
Yeah.
because of course, safety first could be used to justify measures like restricting walking, like saying only cross with the signal at the corner. But safety first was flexible enough that the people who were saying, wait a minute, it's the motorists who are the threat. They're the only people who are actually injuring and killing anybody. Let's invoke safety first to require mandatory speed governors so that you can't speed. The same slogan can be used either way. And this is exactly why the automotive interest groups, by the early to mid 1920s, they're saying we don't want to have anything to do with this term safety first. They are very explicit about it. This term is too dangerous for us. So they initially loved it, but they dropped it by the mid 20s.
Hi, my name is Junko Yoshida. I'm the editor-in-chief of Phil and Junko and AV Safety. And here we have our second episode of our joint podcast. And in addition to Phil, today we have a guest, Peter Norton, associate professor at the University of Virginia. In this episode, I think we have a rare opportunity to have a historian not only reflecting on the past, but also looking into the future on the autonomous vehicle technology. So, Peter, in your LinkedIn profile, you described your academic study as with concentration on history of technology. Maybe you can tell us first a little bit about yourself and the areas of your expertise.
Well, as a teacher, I teach a history of technology of in all domains. But as a researcher, I tend to specialize on the history of mobility, especially over the last century or two. And I think that has a lot to teach us about today. We have learned a lot of things the hard way. And just like in our personal lives, our memories of making mistakes help us do better the next time. We also have collective memory in the form of history that can teach us to do things better the next time as well.
Today's theme is about safety first. This is a slogan often presented by the past and the present transportation industries, actually other industries as well. But we're going to focus on railroad, aviation, automotive, the transportation. In that realm, now Phil just wrote a piece entitled Safety is Not Their First Priority, in which he pointed out the safety first is a wrong message that AV companies are sending. So I'm going to start with Phil. Why safety first is a wrong message? Let's start from there.
Okay. Hi, Peter. Great to see you on the podcast. Thanks for coming. So diving in, when I say safety is not the first priority, I think that's just a reflection of reality. Uh, Companies like to say, well, safety's first because it sounds so good, and I guess it sells. But objectively, companies are not in business to provide safety. They're in business to make money for their shareholders. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's our system. But they're not going to do safety to the extent that it bankrupts the company and they go out of business. No, nobody benefits from that. And so I think people realize that it's just a slogan and it actually can hurt when they're seen to act in ways that are not actually safety first. So it sounds great, it sells in the short term, but I think it degrades trust in the long term. The way I look at it is you have safety and you have cost and you have effectiveness and maybe some other things, but those are sort of the big three. And there are always trade-offs there. It's never that you can have the ultimate safety. No, nobody wants to take a $10,000 robo-taxi ride because the $20 robotaxi ride is 10% less safe. No one can afford a $10,000 robotaxi ride. It's not happening. So there are trade-offs there. On the other hand, you don't want to get into a situation where you say, well, yeah, safety, yeah, it's close enough. It would cost 10 cents more to be safer. Well, that's probably not the right answer too. And our societal system works that way, and our legal system even works that way. It's the notion of cost-effective safety, things like this. But I think for a novel technology like autonomous vehicles, there is a floor, there's a threshold that if you're less safe than a certain amount, you don't get to play. There's a certain amount of safety that's table stakes. In one dimension of that, there are many dimensions, but one dimension is if your robotaxi is more dangerous than a human driver, that's probably an issue. And so it looks more like meeting the threshold requirement absolutely has to be high priority. But after you're over the threshold requirement, it's not quite as same. It's not a static priority. It's a table stakes kind of thing. Professor Herb Simon has this theory called satisficing an engineer. And what he talks about in that theory is that it's not, engineers love to optimize, they love to be the best at everything possible. But in the real world, at some point, you're good enough to go to market, and there's no point chasing further optimization. And so asking what's the priority is the wrong question. The right question is, are you as safe as you need to be? Are you as cost effective as you need to be? Things like this, and not priority one, priority two, priority three.
Yeah. All right, that's good. From a non-engineering standpoint, that as a reporter, I often hear that companies, when I send out a media inquiry, whatever happened to that robotaxi stuck on the streets, things like that, right? And the AV companies always come back saying safety is our first priority, right? And this is, yeah, and then like a reporter in me and said, "Oh, come on! I mean, like, that's not the thing that I was asking. Don't start with every response with that safety first messaging." But then it got me thinking that AV industry is not the first one who really kind of glam onto this safety first slogan. So I just want to ask Peter, who started it, and when did it start, and where did it start? Can you explain a little bit history of the safety first thing?
Safety first began in heavy industries, including railroads, steel making, the manufacturing in general, any mining too, any place where workers were likely to get injured or killed. The injury rate and the death rate in heavy industries in America 120 years ago or more was really horrific. And one reason why it was horrific is that the employers had typically no liability. There was a widow's fund, and the widow got something, and that was it. They just replaced the person who lost a limb or died. And of course, this is terrible publicity, but the power balance at the time was such that the companies could get away with this. What shifted the balance of power, I think, predictably, is a combination of publicity and liability exposure to financial costs. You see this first in the railroads because the railroads inherently are interstate enterprises. And so they had to keep statistics, data matters, and they had to publicize, they had to report the data to the federal government. Here's how many people were injured, here's how many people were killed. And then this was public information, and it was quite embarrassing to the railroad companies. And so the railroad companies, not out of benevolence, really, but more out of good business sense, said we need to curtail injuries and deaths. And you could see a number of initiatives, but the most significant one was one at the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. In 1910, they put a man on the job. His name was Ralph Richards, and he coined the term safety first, which you do find in isolated uses long before that. But he really said to the railroad, let's make this a slogan. And what Phil's describing is its use as a
Mm.
slogan more than as a credible, logical engineering uh, thesis. It's a slogan. And I think actually, to be fair, they perceived it as a slogan. This is that we need to associate ourselves with safety, and this is how we'll do it. Now, this movement really took off, though, the next year in 1911, because for the first time, states were starting to pass workmen's compensation laws that said you have to pay to the families of workers who are killed, you have to pay to workers who are injured. There had been laws before that that were typically overturned by particularly the Supreme Court. But that stopped. And in 1911, Illinois passed a workmen's compensation law, and then the other states imitated it, sometimes word for word. And all of a sudden, all the big manufacturers, including the ones that aren't immediately engaged in interstate commerce, they say, let's get together and come up with a plan to reduce the number of people killed because our insurance premiums are going way up. The companies had insurance for this, but the premiums went way up because the costs were going way up. They met together in 1912, so you can see the is really rapid. And by the next year, we have a body that's still with us today, the National Safety Council, who's really began as a coalition of businesses eager to find a way to reduce the cost exposure to them from workplace injuries and accidents and deaths.
So it started with actually a pretty good intention, right? They really meant it
They
with the
meant it. Now
railroad.
they meant it as businesses tend to mean it. They meant it for financial reasons, and so the intentions were good. Now the strategy, and this includes the term safety first, was maybe a little less inspirational because the number one strategy was to try to deflect responsibility away from the company and toward the worker in the safety campaigns. So all of a sudden, safety campaigns went big time in workplaces, but the messaging in the workplace was, don't be a stupid worker, don't be a foolish worker. And well, and there's good cause for this. And there was some practical and actually useful instruction in safety, but there was also a lot of ridicule and derision at carelessness, um, with the deliberate attention of making a workplace injury or death uh, characterizable as the worker's fault. Now, workmen's compensation laws, offset that blame, but it was a deterrent to careless behavior, and it was deflecting pressure away from some other kinds of workplace changes that might have been more expensive, like new equipment, new safety procedures, slower work pace for reasons of safety. All of those things were less attractive, and so the emphasis was don't be a foolish worker. In fact, there was a fictional foolish worker character who is sawing his arm off in every cartoon appearing on posters on the wall. His name was Otto Nobetter, first name Otto, last name Nobetter. And his image was shared. The companies shared this campaign, so it didn't matter if they were competing companies. They all had access to Otto Nobetter posters and cartoons illustrating this dope getting himself injured and killed. And clearly, the effort there is to make the workers assume a responsibility for their own safety, thereby reducing some of the pressure on the employer.
That's a
Yeah.
classic because you can basically, if you blame the person, if you get rid of the person, the problem's been solved, right? You don't have to fix anything if you fire the person because they were the
Right.
problem.
That's
And
right.
now I can't help but notice that this parallels the general theme of the nut behind the wheel,
Oh
right?
yeah,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So
right.
it's,
Yeah, we have
yeah.
this problem of, how do you who's responsible for the horrific deaths and injuries on the roads and
Yeah.
the nut
Yeah.
behind the wheel metaphor, which goes back, I think, to the teens. I mean, 1910s. In other words, it's almost from the beginning of mass automobility, is one way of putting the pressure on the driver, which takes some of the pressure off the manufacturer or the road builder.
Wow. So my question is then, when did we change the focus from workers to the people on the street, whether it's being run over by railroad or being run over the uh, cars? I mean, did that point of view ever change?
Yes, so the National Safety Council, which began in 1912, really exclusively interested in industrial safety, workplace safety, safety at manufacturing enterprises and mines and railroads. And at first, that's all they did. But they saw opportunities just a few years into their earliest beginnings to switch to a new category that they called public safety.
Uh,
And this, of course, coincided with some important trends. One was that public health was increasingly growing into a problem of um, accident prevention, to use their vocabulary. They called crashes accidents. And enormously impressive gains were being made in the prevention of communicable diseases. This is the era when you get vaccines and when you get success preventing numerous infectious diseases. Sanitation, of course, is also improving. And so there's a recognition, therefore, that we need new attention on injuries. And there's actually a guy who kind of carried this transition out more than anybody else. He worked for International Harvester, which of course was a manufacturer, so they were interested in workplace safety. But he saw an opportunity. His name was Charles Price. He said, let's talk cities into public safety campaigns. We are going to talk to their business leaders, the local business leaders, the chambers of commerce, and they can be members. And in return, we're going to reduce their injuries and deaths on streets, also in fires and other kinds of public safety areas. And this will be a way to get insurance premiums down. Auto clubs can join so that their members can get better auto insurance rates because the accident rates will presumably go down. And local businesses will be interested as well for reasons of liability of their own. So Charles Price parlayed industrial safety into public safety, and it's almost a direct one-to-one import. So we had Otto Nobetter, who is directing blame at the worker in industrial safety, but then we have an equally ridiculous caricature, the jaywalker, who is the Otto Nobetter of the street, the person who's too stupid to know how to cross the street without getting injured or killed. And so that's the direct one-to-one import. And safety first as a slogan was imported as well. Beginning in industrial safety, it ended up in public safety.
So I
wow.
think one of the issues is when you say safety first, well, it's hard to argue with safety being important, but part of it is who's holding the bag.
Right.
And if
Whose
if
safety
if
is it?
if the victim is the one holding the bag, you've got a problem because they're yes, they're incentivized to be safe, but they don't have a lot of control over the environment they're put into.
Bill, that's exactly right. And you can see this debate exactly as you just framed it, unfolding on American city streets right in the early years of public safety, because the company members, the insurance companies and so on, and the chambers of commerce, they were interested in things like deterring pedestrians from walking where they wanted. But the National Safety Council also invited people to join with $1 personal memberships. And a lot of parents and school teachers and local civic leaders joined, and they used their memberships to make the public safety campaigns blame cars and drivers. So immediately you see this schism where the pro-automobile groups that saw safety first as a way to make people defer to drivers. They're up against another group of people, also members of the National Safety Council, who say, no, drivers are the problem. And in their public safety campaigns, you often saw the Grim Reaper as an image driving the car, harvesting children in front of it in a way that was very alarming
Wow.
to the automobile interests.
Yeah. Wow. This is a very rich history. In other words, like safety first is just kind of a slogan used as a foil to prevent us from getting into the real problem, right? The real
That's right.
problem that the industry had to solve. It's like shifted the blame to the
That's right.
people who are exposed to the technology, right?
But it was shiftable back and forth, as Phil pointed out as well,
Yeah.
because of course safety first could be used to justify measures like restricting walking, like saying, only cross with the signal at the corner. But safety first was flexible enough that the people who were saying, wait a minute, it's the motorists who are the threat. They're the only people who are actually injuring and killing anybody. Let's invoke safety first to require mandatory speed governors so that you can't speed. So
Ah,
the same slogan is it can be used either way. And this is exactly why the automotive interest groups by the early to mid 1920s, they're saying we don't want to have anything to do with this term safety first. They are very explicit about it. This term is too dangerous for us. So they initially loved it, but they dropped it by the mid 20s.
oh, they did.
Yeah, they did.
Oh, okay.
They
When did,
ridiculed it. Yeah.
wow. Did it ever come back? When did it come back?
Well, I mean, you've noticed it coming back yourselves very recently. Um, I have never noticed the automobile industry taking an interest in this term since the mid 20s. It's different for insurance companies.
Okay.
Insurance companies did take an interest in this term and they kept it. So there was a tension between the insurance companies' interests and the auto manufacturers' interests, and you can see that manifested in part over this term. Some manufacturers, automakers, did see opportunities to associate their vehicles with safety. Ford, rather famously in 1956, launched a whole range of optional features you could get on your car. They called them lifeguard features.
All right. Yes.
But, the conventional wisdom is that it backfired because General Motors was all about the style and the power. And the expression soon went around that Ford sells safety, but General Motors sells cars.
That whipped around on Ford where they got to the point they said, "Oh, safety doesn't sell," and then you had the whole Ford Pinto thing. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
there's
Which
a
beautiful,
pendulum that swings there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the Pinto beautifully exemplifies your point, Phil, earlier on when you said, when it's just a few cents or a few dollars per car, to buy you a lot of safety, of course you do that. But
Yeah.
as you know, with the Pinto, they made the opposite calculation.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. I want to go back to the railroad thing a little bit because I noticed that Phil, you co-authored a paper. It was I think for the Law Journal with
It was
yeah,
with Bill Wyden, with Professor
Bill Wyden,
William Wyden from University of Miami School of Law. Right, Bill
right.
Wyden.
And kind of focus on the regulation. I just want to go back to the railroad example, how the industry actually looked at the regulation and how they try to sort of change the law to fit their purposes. Let's go back to that your piece, the co-authored piece on the uh, on this.
Sure. We're back in the mid 1800s, and there were a bunch of rail disasters. Railroads were really dangerous, like a factor of 100 times more dangerous than flying is today. Like
Mm.
really dangerous. Okay.
Yeah.
And there were a bunch of crashes as so they rolled out the technology across the country faster than they could keep up on safety. And things got kind of out of hand. And by the way, this is all written up in at the end of a paper, and we'll put the paper on the show notes. So I'm
Yeah.
just doing the quick summary. And then the Civil War came, and that sort of distracted people from rail safety. But when the war was over, it sort of came back. And there were a lot of corner cutting on safety. For example, they would use wooden rail cars, which would not do well in a crash. Okay, they could use steel, but they didn't, and they had ineffective brakes, which is why George Westinghouse invented the air brake, right? But before that, there were
Westinghouse,
ineffective
yeah,
brakes.
right.
And the general rule was, well, our trains can't stop, so it's your obligation to get out of the way. They were blamed, there were
Go back to the same thing,
potentially
yeah.
hundreds of kids killed playing on train tracks, and it was the kids' fault. They shouldn't have been playing on the tracks, right? It's the analog of get out of the road, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This is my road, get out of it. And there were some, then they got regulatory and legal capture that there's a legal term called proximate cause, which got reinterpreted in a way favorable to them. And the story I've heard told is that there was a one particular incident where sparks out of a steam locomotive hit a roof and caught a building on fire. And the railroad was held responsible for that building. But it was a row of houses. And all the houses except the first one, they said that was not the railroad's responsibility because it caught fire because the house next to it had nothing to do with the railroad. Yeah, it was just crazy stuff. All right. And so what they did was they were able to get the court system and regulatory system to be extremely favorable to them. And now we're seeing this in autonomous vehicles. We're seeing some states where literally the computer is responsible for crash, but computers aren't legal people. It's Oklahoma. Go look at, I looked it up. Okay.
Mm, mm,
The
Yeah,
computers aren't people. They can't own property. You can't sue them. So it's nonsensical. Well, what's it there for? It's there to make it harder, more expensive, more difficult to go after a company
mm,
for causing a crash, right? That's the only reason why it would be there.
yeah.
No other reason makes sense. So the railroads went through the same process, which is why we put this in the paper.
Right.
I should give Bill did the heavy lifting on this section, so I'm just telling the story. But then the railroads had some problems, and it wasn't safety, passenger safety as much. There was something about the worker safety, which became an issue, but
Right.
also they charged a lot of money and the Grange
Oh,
Grange was formed because the farmers were upset they had a monopoly. We're back in
yeah.
the robber baron era,
Robber baron,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And eventually there was enough cumulative backlash against the rail companies that the Interstate Commerce Commission was formed. And they started out regulating commerce, but then they got into the safety regulation business. And by the time we're done, you had almost 100 years of the US rail industry being so regulated by the ICC that it made it difficult for them to thrive as a business. So you can argue that they were over-regulated, including on safety. And
Mm.
so the reason we put this in our article was the story is I'll tell the story a little differently. My takeaway is, well, you can do regulatory capture and you can game the law and game everything. And if you have enough power and enough influence, you can really tilt the playing field in your favor.
In your favor,
But
yeah.
eventually, if you cause too much trouble and too much harm, and people get too upset against you, you can expect regulatory backlash. And
mm,
that can, in essence, kill the entire industry. So your choice is, and this is a tricky choice. One choice is to say, well, we have to do our IPO, we have to do our SPAC, we have to create value for shareholders, and we're going to push the regulatory day of reckoning down the football field as far as we can because the CEO will be retired by then, or we'll have our SPAC by then, we'll have our IPO by then. You can just keep kicking that can down the road, and then the regulatory backlash is someone else's problem. And there's tremendous incentive to do that, and that feels like what the industry is doing. Or you can get ahead of it and say, no, no, we would rather be reasonable and set reasonable playing rules to avoid the downstream backlash. And folks
Mm.
like me, I'm an engineer. I like to be rational about these things. I'd rather see them avoid the backlash, but that's
Yeah,
not what I see happening. So now over to Peter for the historical perspective on, that's the dynamic I see at work.
Oh,
yeah.
well, I think you've handled it beautifully. I don't have much to add to it. You certainly, though, can see that similar sort of push and pull or give and take. You take too much risk, and yeah, you risk a backlash. And of course, the classic example in the automotive sector is the 1960s safety backlash when the death toll was really horrific, up around 50,000 a year, even when there was far less driving then than now. And this is when you see opportunities for advocates, for rebels, like Ralph Nader especially, to expose this. And of course, he was far from alone. There were other exposés as well. And then you see political opportunity follow from that. So you can gain political points in Congress by championing this rebellion, which of course loses you the backing of this major industry group, but gains you a new political
Mm.
momentum as well. So I think these are patterns, and Phil has illustrated the pattern through the railroads, and of course you can see it in other enterprises as well.
I have a question for you, Peter. I've observed that effective regulation that promotes safety only happens after the big disaster. And the 1960s, as you were talking about, that's how we got National Highway Traffic Safety Administration as a result of that. And there are other stories about air disasters creating FAA.
Yep.
Big problems creating National Transportation Safety Board. So do we have to wait for a big autonomous vehicle disaster for the industry to really get behind safety? I mean, they say they're behind safety, but we know that they're racing to market, right? And what's it going to take for safety really to be first in terms of effective regulation and policies that require transparent reporting and all these other things that safety advocates would like to see?
Well, I think I trust your judgment on the answer to that question more than my own. My own answer is coming, of course, from a non-engineer who's observing how this has unfolded.
But this is not
And
about engineering. This is about politics, right?
so okay, you're exactly right. And of course, what we have seen is, especially when there were a range of viable competitors, risk taking was where it was at, because if you were cautious, the less risk averse competitors would pass you by. You can see this in the coding of the Uber that killed Elaine Hertzberg in Arizona in 2018, where it's deliberately programmed not to be so cautious as it could easily have been to
Mhm.
prevent her death. The car didn't begin braking until after it struck her. And there is a business calculation there, namely that if we are cautious enough to make that crash not happen, then we will be so cautious that others will pass us by. Potential riders will not want to ride with us because of all of the braking. Now that environment may be changing as increasingly we see this market being uh, really dominated by Waymo. And so Waymo, because of the fact that it's owned by Alphabet, and because Alphabet is not intent on immediate business growth, they have the money it takes to be patient. Maybe that will change the calculation even without really terrible headlines. But I say that very cautiously.
Yeah.
What aren't the other companies incentivized to cut corners on safety to catch up?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So the more Waymo dominates, the more it makes kind of
Ah,
rational business sense for the would-be competitors, Zoox and so on, to take risks, because how are they going to survive otherwise? Of course, another way that they hold on is to differentiate themselves, and I think this has been
right,
Zoox's strategy. They say, we're not Waymo, we're doing something quite different here. But
right.
anybody who wants to be like Waymo at this point is certainly going to have to take risks, because otherwise they'll be left behind.
It's sort of the discussion going on right now in the AV industry that the camp is pushing end-to-end machine learning versus that well, let's do sort of like a modular machine learning
Mm.
method, right? I mean,
Mhm.
there's like they're trying to sort of portray themselves. We are different from the traditional AV industry. What do you think,
Mm.
Phil? Is that what's
Yeah,
what you think?
That's right. The push is towards end-to-end machine learning, which is camera pixels and lidar in driving out, and in between is statistical magic.
Mm.
I'm having a little fun with that, but that's an approximation. There's a really interesting dynamic there. As far as I can tell, end-to-end machine learning, you can stand up a car that is fluent at driving, basic competence at driving much faster with a much smaller team.
Mm.
Okay.
But trying to teach it edge cases is much harder because you can't tell it, oh, here's what to do. You have to give it a bunch of training data and it has to statistically infer what the action is in that particular situation. In one of the possible explanations for problems running by school buses is stop signs mean something different when they're on a pole than when they're on a school bus. And red flashing lights mean something different. Because stop signs and red flashing lights mean stop and then go, unless they're on a school bus, in which case it means stop and then stop. And so while I don't know that's the root cause of the incidents we've been seeing with robotaxis going by school buses, it's the kind of problem I would expect to be difficult to solve in machine learning. It's not the only one. It's just a concrete example we
Yeah.
know has happened. And so the issue is if you're using end-to-end machine learning to catch up or to get ahead,
Yeah.
you may be deferring the safety challenges to later. And you can have 100 cars on the road and it looks really great because you don't see 1 in a million with 100 cars.
Right.
Not often, right? But
Yeah.
with a million cars, that's sort of the definition of 1 in a million. It's going to happen every day.
Right.
And so I think the scaling up is going to be challenging and there's going to be pressure to get on the road and maybe safety will be okay with end-to-end machine learning to just get on the road.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to see a really long, dragged out process
Yeah.
getting past, I call it the first 99% is getting the 100 cars on the road. And getting up to 10,000 cars is the other 99% because it feels like you're almost there, but you're not.
It's
Mm.
The rare
interesting.
events are really going to be an issue. Now, I know from a historical perspective, the rail system had those kind of issues that if you have a handful of trains, you can figure stuff out. But when they were operating at scale, they would have things called cornfield meets, where two trains, there'd only be one track because of cost, and you were time sharing the track, and they would get the times wrong, and the two trains would hit in the middle. And that's a problem that gets worse at scale. So part of the safety problem the trains had was as you put more trains on a certain number of tracks, you're going to have higher risk of collision.
Oh,
That's
gee.
how we got standard time.
That's how, yeah, one way we got standard
Ah,
time was to coordinate trade movements. That's right. And the other thing we got was block safety
Mm.
systems, which are controlled chunks of track so that only one train can be on them at a time. You know, those were sort of safety innovations, but things had to get pretty bad before either of those innovations happened. They had to feel a certain amount of pain before they said, "All right, we got to fix this."
Mm.
I want to bring back this conversation to the regulation. I think we talked about the uh, back in the days, railroad industry kind of suffered from over regulations. And we hear that argument all the time, even today. But the things that people really need to pay attention is that compared to aviation industry or I don't know, that we could even bring out the FDA or the even railroad. I
Well,
mean, the
petrochemical refineries are a good
yeah,
example.
exactly.
Yeah.
Automotive industry has been miraculously free of regulation. Would you say that?
Well, so on the subject of robotic vehicles, I think Phil would know way more on that question than I do. But certainly, my impression is that the regulations are, infantile and minimal and state by state and just insignificant. Now, I did just learn in New York last week that the regulations for operating there are very strict, but of course, we have a federal system, and then other states are much more welcoming.
Yeah.
I would say just for automotive in general, automotive is less rigorously regulated than other industries typically. So automotive is the only industry I know of where conforming to industry safety standards is entirely optional and discretionary on a practical basis. There's some industries where the safety, like some consumer goods, it's not strictly required, but as a practical matter, everyone does it.
Yeah.
And in automotive, the original equipment manufacturers, the manufacturers, do not follow their own safety standards, even for regular cars. They want their supply chain to follow them, but it's really hard to find a company that actually follows the safety standards. There's some, especially in Europe, but it's just not a thing. And the federal government certainly does not require it at all. Right. And so
Yeah.
that's part of it. And then the autonomous vehicle companies are, basically, I'm taking some liberties here, but it amounts to standards. We don't need no stinking standards. Trust us, we got it. We got it covered. There were some publications that amounted to, yeah, we looked at the standard. We're a special snowflake, doesn't apply to us. No company in the AV space that I know of will stand up and say, yes, we actually conform to the autonomous vehicle safety standard. No company will do that, and most of them are very far from that.
This account reminds me very much of what you just mentioned, Junko, when you mentioned the Food and Drug Administration, because it had that model too. It goes back to 1906, but its uh, modus operandi was that no company wants to injure or kill its own customers, and therefore we will trust the companies until there's a catastrophe. And there were occasional catastrophes, like the Sulfa catastrophe in the 1930s when a lot of people were killed. But the transition point illustrates Phil's point to earlier on that a disaster does yield change. So, as you will know, in 1960, a drug from the Merrill Pharmaceutical Company came before them, and its generic name was thalidomide. And the inspector, there was only 7 full-time inspectors at FDA. That was it. Frances Oldham Kelsey, it was I think it was her first major drug review. She said, now, wait a minute, this drug, you're not even saying it's going to save anybody's life. Let's wait and see what happens in Europe, where it's legal. And of course, the birth defects were horrific. And she prevented that by saying you can't have this drug despite incredible pressure from the Merrill company. So, yeah, we may be in a pre-1960 FDA version for the auto industry and the AV industry, where the assumption is the companies, for their own business interest, have to be careful, and therefore our regulations can be light. But that logic doesn't always hold up.
Yeah.
Well, where we are now in the US is that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is the regulator for safety for equipment, and they primarily operate via recalls. So they
Mm.
wait for a bad record to show up on the cars. Wait for the crashes to pile up. Not
Yeah.
not always, but the general thing is you have hundreds, thousands of mishaps, tens of injuries, maybe some fatalities, and then they act and they force a recall,
Now, Phil,
which of course, yeah,
you're making a distinction I need a little help with. So
yeah,
clearly there are federal mandates for things like seat belts and airbags.
yeah.
And you seem to be treating those as if they're a separate category from what you're talking about here.
So for autonomous vehicles and anything that has to do with computer software,
I see.
there are no requirements. There's a
Okay.
thing called Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, and even that actually is recall. So what happens is there's Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. It's a list of things. It's a list of tests that you run, right? And
Mhm.
some of the tests you run are the headlights bright enough? Do the seat belts work properly? Do the airbags inflate the way they're supposed to? Does the yellow warning light come up when your tires run out of air to a certain amount? And they're all completely reproducible, in principle at least, tests you run on the car. But those are not tested by the federal government. So NHTSA does not
I see.
test the cars before they go on the road. In Europe, they have type approval. They actually test the cars before they go on the road. But in the US, you can put anything you want on the road and you put a sticker in it. If you've seen the tire pressure numbers on that sticker in your door, if you look closer at the sticker, usually that's the sticker. It also says Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard self-certification. that they have self-certified that they follow those rules. And if NHTSA, uh, the regulator, believes that they have not actually conformed to the rules, they can force a recall to conform to the rules. But the car companies are doing what they want to do. They know what the rules are. They're supposed to be following them. They're documented incidents in the AV industry of them putting the sticker in without following the rules. That's actually happened. Okay. So they're on there. It's the honor system to put the sticker in, and the sticker has nothing to do with self-driving. It's all about the tires and the headlights and the seats and the seatbelts, and that's not bad, but it has nothing to do with self-driving. They go out on the road, and then when bad things happen, there's a recall, and then the companies are supposed to fix the recall, but the regulators don't approve the recall, and there have been situations where it was pretty clear the company just sort of waved their hands at it, but didn't really fix it. But now that resets the timer, and now there has to be an investigation for another couple of years to see if the fix really worked, and and this is how it goes.
Okay.
So it's pretty weak on a regulatory basis.
Right.
Whereas the FAA, in aircraft, they do have to follow their own industry safety standards, not true of automotive. So the regulator does not require anyone to follow safety standards other than that test regime, right? But not the functional safety, not the ISO standards, not the UL standards, none of the written industry consensus standards. Aviation does have to follow those standards. And the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, is there every step of the way with representatives, making sure every test got done, making sure the design reviews, making sure the standards were conformed to, but also being in the room where a lot of this is happening. So that's just a night and day difference.
I see.
So the FAA learned, why do we have safe aircraft? One of the reasons we have safe aircraft is the industry learned that they need to follow safety processes instead of fixing whatever caused the last crash. They sort of hit a plateau on safety, and they had to get ahead of the crashes instead of waiting for them. That was the first thing. And the second thing they also did was they said, all right, we're going to make sure that we have external accountability for following the safety standards. And the car companies in the US don't do either one of those things.
Wow.
Now they could. And you will say, well, we try, we do the best we can, we're really smart, we have limited resources, we do, et cetera, et cetera. But the independent oversight to force them to actually follow the safety standards and to get ahead of the crashes, it's all voluntary. And as we said before, they're all in a race.
Yep.
Yeah. That actually gives little confidence to a reporter like myself that the safety, when they say safety first, it's kind of an empty suit. I mean, it's if they really meant it, they could have done something, or they would have been able to do something, right?
Well, you don't know. It depends on the company, right?
Yeah.
And the companies are grading their own homework, and they're not necessarily telling us what's going on. There are easy questions you can ask. You can say, well, which safety standards do you conform to? Don't give me this, well, we sort of kind of follow it as best we can. No.
We follow the spirit of ISO
The spirit of,
26.
and I've been in situations where I got to watch how companies followed standards they said they kind of did, and it's not, it's not a B-, it's a D+ on a good day, right? It's not great. So either you conform to the standard or you don't. And if you don't conform to the standard, well, why should we believe safety? I mean, there's an international standard your company probably helped write and you don't follow it. How is that safety first?
There you go. I think that's the last word. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming to the show. That we learned a lot. We actually did the whole tour of not only the history, but different industries. And Peter, thank you very much for chiming in some of the examples, specific examples you brought to the table. Very helpful.
I'm so glad. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. You make a wonderful team. I love the complementarity.
Well, it's really great to have you on, Peter. It's nice to have this perspective. There's not just a couple of geeks geeking out on
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. I'm not a geek, but he is.
Well, it's a pleasure to join you. I've been long admirers of your work separately, so to see you combined in this way is just beautiful.
Well, thanks for that.
Thank you very much. All right. We'll see you soon.
Okay,
Bye.
great. Bye-bye.